At sunrise, 10,000 men stood up from their trenches, not knowing they were already dead. No ambush warning, no retreat order, no chance to escape. Somewhere far behind the front line, a single sentence had been written on a piece of paper. It looked harmless, routine, almost forgettable. That sentence sent them forward. Within hours, the valley ahead would become so full of bodies that the ground itself would disappear. Entire units would vanish without sending a final message. Officers would die before giving a single order. Medics would be shot while treating the wounded. And when it was finally over, no one would be punished. Because the disaster didn't begin with a gunshot. It began with a mistake. A small one. The kind that kills 10,000 men. The artillery stopped at dawn. Not because the battle was over, but because someone, somewhere behind the lines, believed it was. On the frozen ground, thousands of men lifted their heads at the same time. The silence felt wrong. For hours, shells had screamed overhead, tearing the earth apart. Now there was nothing, no warning, no explanation, just a sudden, unnatural quiet stretching across the front. Some soldiers thought it meant relief was coming. Others feared it meant something worse. They were all wrong. The mistake had already been made. The order had been written the night before, typed under weak light by an exhausted staff officer who had not slept in nearly 48 hours. The map on the table was outdated by weeks. Front lines had shifted, villages had changed hands, units had been merged, broken, or wiped out entirely. But the order did not reflect that chaos. It couldn't. The war was moving faster than paper ever could. The message was simple, almost harmless. Advance at first light, enemy resistance minimal. It was wrong. By the time the truth reached the men who would pay for it, there would be no one left to stop what followed. At dawn, infantry units began to move. Boots crunched against frost, weapons were checked in silence. Officers repeated the same reassurance: the enemy is pulling back. This is a push, not an assault. The men believed them. They wanted to believe them. Some had survived months of fighting by trusting orders, no matter how little sense they made. Others were new, young, untested, still clinging to the idea that war followed rules. Ahead of them lay a shallow valley, partially concealed by trees and broken terrain. According to command reports, it was lightly defended. According to reality, it was one of the most heavily prepared killing grounds on the entire front. The enemy had not withdrawn. They had been waiting. The first shots came without warning. A single machine gun opened fire from the left flank, cutting down the front rank before anyone understood what was happening. Men fell forward, backward, sideways, some without ever hearing the sound that killed them. Then another gun. Then another. Within seconds, the valley erupted. Mortars slammed into advancing formations. Artillery followed, pre-registered coordinates hitting with terrifying precision. The silence of dawn vanished, replaced by explosions, screams, and confusion so complete it felt unreal. Officers tried to shout orders, but no one could hear them. Radios crackled with panic. Units that were supposed to be advancing together were suddenly isolated, pinned down, or erased entirely. And still, from headquarters miles away, the map showed progress. The mistake revealed itself slowly. Reports from the front contradicted the original assessment, but they arrived fragmented and delayed. One unit claimed to be under heavy fire. Another said resistance was unexpected. A third went silent altogether. Staff officers tried to assemble the picture, but the information didn't fit the plan, so they assumed the problem was temporary. They told themselves the men would push through. They always did. No one wanted to be the one who said the plan was wrong. By mid-morning, the valley was filled with smoke and bodies. Survivors pressed themselves into the ground, digging with bare hands where shovels had been lost or shattered. Wounded men cried out, then stopped. Medics crawled forward and were cut down where they knelt. Still, the orders remained unchanged. Advance. From above, it looked like movement. From the ground, it was slaughter. The enemy had anticipated everything. Every approach route had overlapping fields of fire. Every pause point was covered by artillery. The advancing troops were not walking into a battle. They were walking into a trap that had been prepared for weeks. Why hadn't command known? Because of one assumption. One line on a report that said the enemy was retreating. That line was wrong. It had come from a reconnaissance unit that never made it back. The patrol had moved out days earlier to confirm enemy positions. Somewhere along the way, it was intercepted. No report of contact reached headquarters. No correction followed. Silence was interpreted as success. The absence of information became confirmation. And from that silence, thousands of men were sent forward. By noon, entire battalions had ceased to exist as fighting units. Officers were dead or wounded. Communications were broken. Men huddled in shell holes, unsure if retreat was allowed, unsure if anyone was still in command at all. Some tried to pull back on their own. They were shot as deserters. Others stayed where they were, waiting for orders that would never come. Above them, enemy aircraft circled, marking positions, directing fire. Every movement was punished. Every mistake was fatal. And the worst part was still ahead. At headquarters, senior commanders faced a choice. They could halt the operation, admit the intelligence was flawed, and order a withdrawal. Or they could continue, hoping that momentum would somehow turn disaster into success. They chose momentum. Reinforcements were ordered forward. Fresh men marched toward the same valley, stepping over the bodies of those who had gone before them. The mistake was no longer small. It was multiplying. By late afternoon, the casualty figures began to surface. At first they seemed impossible. Too high. Too fast. Numbers were revised, then revised again. Still, no full retreat was ordered. No one wanted to take responsibility for stopping the advance. To stop meant admitting the original order had been wrong, and that thousands of men had died because of it. So the fighting continued. As darkness fell, the valley glowed red from burning equipment and tracer fire. The ground was unrecognizable. What had once been farmland was now churned mud, broken weapons, and bodies frozen in the positions where they had fallen. Some soldiers tried to crawl back under cover of night. Few succeeded. The enemy fired flares, turning night into day, hunting movement with methodical calm. By midnight, the valley was silent again. Not because the battle was over, but because there was no one left to fight. The next morning, headquarters finally understood. The map was wrong. The reports were wrong. The assumption had been fatal. By the time a withdrawal order was issued, it meant nothing. The units it was meant for no longer existed. When the final count was taken days later, the number stunned even hardened veterans. Nearly 10,000 men, killed, wounded, or missing. All traced back to a single error. A single sentence. A single assumption that the enemy was no longer there. History would later record the battle as a failed offensive. That phrase would hide the truth. It would hide the screams, the confusion, the hours of helpless waiting under fire. It would hide the fact that this disaster did not begin with courage or cowardice, but with a mistake so small it barely registered at the time. And it would hide what came next, because the men who survived would spend the rest of their lives asking the same question. How could something so small kill so many? The mistake did not begin on the battlefield. It began days earlier, in a quiet room far from gunfire, where decisions were made with pencils, rulers, and assumptions. The headquarters sat safely beyond the range of enemy artillery. The windows were boarded, the lights dimmed, the air thick with cigarette smoke and fatigue. Maps covered the walls, some newly printed, others patched with handwritten notes and pins marking units that no longer existed. The men inside were not cowards. Many had fought before. But here the war arrived second-hand through reports, radio messages, and delayed fragments of truth. And that distance mattered. The enemy withdrawal had seemed obvious. For weeks, reconnaissance aircraft had reported fewer visible movements. Prisoners spoke of exhausted units. Intercepted communications suggested redeployments elsewhere. Even artillery fire had dropped off. To tired minds, it all pointed in one direction. The enemy was pulling back. No one asked the most dangerous question in war. What if this is deliberate? The frontline commanders had raised concerns. Some patrols reported trenches that looked abandoned but felt wrong, too neat, too intact. Others noticed supply dumps left behind, almost as if meant to be found. There were even rumors of new fortifications deeper in the valley. But rumors do not carry weight. Paper does. And on paper, the situation looked clear. The intelligence officer who finalized the assessment had joined the staff only weeks earlier. He was competent, by the book, and overwhelmed. Reports piled up faster than he could verify them. Communications lines were unreliable. Units reported positions hours late, sometimes days. He did what doctrine allowed. He filled in the gaps. The missing reconnaissance patrol was the key. It had been sent to confirm whether the enemy's forward defenses were still occupied. When it failed to return, the assumption was simple: radio failure, delay, or redeployment. No distress signal had been received. No gunfire reported. Therefore, the patrol must have slipped through undetected. That assumption became fact. The final briefing lasted less than 20 minutes. The senior commander stood before the map, tracing the advance route with a pointer. He spoke confidently, calmly, as if certainty itself could make the plan true. "Enemy resistance is expected to be light," he said. "Their main forces are believed to be withdrawing. This advance will restore momentum." Momentum. That word carried more weight than evidence. No one wanted to challenge him. The room was filled with men who understood hierarchy. To object meant delay. Delay meant hesitation. And hesitation, in a war already slipping from control, felt dangerous. One officer did speak. He asked whether artillery reconnaissance had confirmed enemy gun positions. The answer was vague. Another asked about air cover. It was promised, though not scheduled. A third suggested waiting for updated reports. The suggestion was ignored. The decision had already been made. Orders were drafted immediately. They were short, precise, and fatally confident. Advance at first light. Enemy resistance minimal. There was no contingency for heavy fire. No fallback plan. No explicit authorization to retreat. Once issued, the order took on a life of its own. By the time doubts began to surface, it was too late. Radio messages from the front arrived during the night, confused, incomplete, contradictory. Some units reported hearing enemy movement. Others mentioned new fortifications silhouetted against moonlight. These reports were logged, not acted upon. The operation was already underway. To stop it now would mean admitting uncertainty. And uncertainty in that room was seen as weakness. The advance began exactly on schedule. As units moved forward and the first casualties mounted, reports flooded back to headquarters. But the information arrived out of sequence. One message spoke of resistance. Another claimed progress. A third reported heavy fire but no exact location. Staff officers tried to assemble a coherent picture. They failed. The map still showed arrows moving forward. The senior commander faced his first real moment of doubt late in the morning. Casualty numbers were rising faster than expected. Entire companies were reporting losses of over 50% within hours. Requests for artillery support grew desperate. But he did not order a halt. Instead, he chose reinforcement. If the first wave was stalled, the second would break through. That belief had ended armies before. It would do so again. Reinforcements were ordered forward with the same faulty intelligence. They were told the initial resistance was localized. They were told the enemy was nearly broken. They were told to move quickly. They obeyed. Behind the scenes, something else was happening. Junior officers, those closest to the reports, began to realize the scale of the disaster. They saw patterns emerging, the same coordinates appearing again and again, the same units going silent in the same areas. The valley was not contested. It was controlled. One staff officer drafted a recommendation to suspend the operation. It never reached the commander. Another tried to reroute artillery to suppress suspected enemy positions. The request stalled in bureaucratic delay. The system moved too slowly to save men who were dying too fast. By early afternoon, denial replaced confusion. The operation had cost too much to stop now. If they withdrew, the losses would have been for nothing. That logic, so human, so flawed, kept the order alive. Advance. Always advance. What no one at headquarters fully grasped was this. The enemy had designed the trap specifically for that mindset. They had reduced visible resistance deliberately. They had allowed rumors of retreat to spread. They had withdrawn just enough to make the advance seem safe. And when the order came, they were ready. The mistake was not ignorance. It was certainty. Certainty built on incomplete information, reinforced by pressure, hierarchy, and fear of responsibility. By the time the truth became undeniable, the cost was already measured in thousands. And still the fighting continued. In the valley, soldiers were learning the truth the only way war teaches it, through blood. They now understood that the advance had never been a push. It had been a sacrifice. But no one had told them. As night approached and the battlefield grew quieter, headquarters prepared its final assessment. The operation would be labeled unsuccessful but necessary. Losses would be described as heavy. The word mistake would not appear anywhere. But the war does not forget. And in the darkness between the burning wreckage and the wounded left behind, the consequences of that decision were still unfolding. Because the chain reaction had not yet reached its end. The disaster did not happen all at once. It spread. Like fire through dry ground, each failure igniting the next, until nothing remained that could be controlled. The first unit to collapse did so quietly. Pinned down by machine gun fire and cut off from communication, its officers were killed within minutes. Without leadership, the men did what instinct demanded. They sought cover, they crawled, they froze. No report of their destruction reached headquarters. On the map, the unit was still advancing. That single gap, between reality and representation, allowed the chain reaction to begin. As neighboring units moved forward, they expected support on their flanks. There was none. Instead, they walked into crossfire meant for formations that no longer existed. Enemy guns shifted smoothly, rehearsed, precise. Every movement was anticipated. Within an hour, 3 companies were trapped in overlapping fire. None of them knew it. Radio operators worked desperately to maintain contact. Batteries failed, antennas were destroyed, signals were drowned by static and panic. Messages arrived half-spoken, cut off mid-sentence. Enemy fire from. Request immediate. We are surrounded. Silence followed. Each silence was interpreted differently. At headquarters, it meant delay. On the ground, it meant death. Officers tried to adapt. Some ordered small advances, hopping to probe enemy positions. Others dug in, believing reinforcements were coming. A few attempted organized withdrawals without authorization. Those officers were later blamed. But at that moment, they were alone, making decisions under fire with no guidance and no support. The enemy understood exactly what was happening. Observers in elevated positions watched the confusion unfold. When one unit stalled, they waited. When another advanced too far, they closed the trap. Artillery fire was adjusted in real time. Mortars targeted medics. Snipers focused on officers. The battlefield became a system, not a fight. The chain reaction reached its critical point when reserves entered the valley. These men had not yet been under fire. They moved in formation, confident, believing they were reinforcing success. Within minutes, that belief was shattered. The enemy allowed them to advance deep, then opened fire from all sides. Entire platoons were erased before they could deploy. Men who had survived months of war died within seconds of their first engagement. Panic spread faster than orders. Some soldiers fired blindly. Others dropped their weapons and ran. A few stood frozen, unable to move, unable to process what was happening around them. Training collapsed. Discipline dissolved. What remained was survival. Friendly fire added to the chaos. Artillery units, acting on outdated coordinates, shelled positions already overrun or still occupied by their own men. Smoke and confusion made identification impossible. Reports of enemy fire were sometimes the sound of their own guns killing their own troops. No one could tell the difference. Attempts to regain control failed. Messengers were sent forward on foot. Most never returned. Command posts closer to the front were overrun or abandoned. Each relocation increased the delay between decision and action. The war moved faster than command could follow. By mid-afternoon, the valley was divided into isolated pockets of resistance. Some groups held out for hours, firing until they ran out of ammunition. Others were surrounded and destroyed methodically. A few surrendered. They were shot. The enemy had no intention of taking prisoners. The chain reaction now extended beyond the valley. Neighboring sectors, hearing the fighting, assumed a breakthrough was underway. Some units advanced prematurely. Others pulled back unnecessarily. The front began to bend and fracture. What had begun as a local operation threatened to unravel the entire line. Headquarters finally issued a partial halt. The message arrived too late and too vague. Proceed with caution. Hold positions where necessary. Await further instructions. These words meant nothing to men under direct fire. They needed clear orders. They received none. The enemy intensified the pressure. As daylight faded, artillery fire became relentless. The ground shook continuously. Wounded men were buried alive in collapsing trenches. Equipment burned, lighting the battlefield with unnatural color. The chain reaction fed itself. More movement meant more fire. More fire meant more casualties. More casualties meant more confusion. By evening, some officers made the only decision left to them. They ordered retreats. Without coordination, without cover, men attempted to escape the valley under fire. Those who moved were targeted immediately. Those who stayed were encircled. There was no safe choice. Only different ways to die. The chain reaction reached its final stage when command lost track of the battlefield entirely. No accurate reports remained. No reliable unit strengths. No clear front line. Just estimates, and estimates were useless now. As night fell, the enemy tightened the noose. Flares illuminated movement. Machine guns fired at anything that shifted. Artillery walked methodically across known positions. By midnight, organized resistance had ceased. Only scattered gunfire remained, isolated men firing their last rounds, or none at all. The mistake had completed its journey. From one false assumption, it had triggered miscommunication. From miscommunication, paralysis. From paralysis, reinforcement of failure. From reinforcement, annihilation. By morning, the valley belonged entirely to the enemy. And the men who had been sent there were either dead, dying, or missing. But the true cost was still being counted. Because the slaughter had not yet been understood, dawn revealed what darkness had concealed. The valley was no longer a battlefield. It was a grave. The fog lifted slowly, clinging to the ground as if unwilling to show what lay beneath it. As light spread across the valley, shapes emerged, broken equipment, torn uniforms. Bodies frozen in the positions where they had fallen. Some lay where they had been cut down mid-advance. Others were piled in shallow depressions where they had sought cover together. None of them had expected to die there. The enemy did not rush forward. They moved carefully, methodically, advancing only after artillery had finished its work. They knew the ground. They knew the fire lanes. Every step was deliberate. Occasional shots rang out as wounded men were discovered and silenced. The battle was over. The killing was not. Throughout the early morning, survivors remained hidden. Some had been unconscious for hours. Others had lain motionless, pretending to be dead, afraid that any movement would draw fire. A few were trapped under bodies, unable to move even if they wanted to. Medics who had survived the night attempted to help. Most were shot before they reached their patients. The scale of the slaughter became clear only gradually. Entire companies were missing. Units that had gone into the valley with hundreds of men now had dozens, or none at all. Officers searched for familiar faces and found only strangers. Radio silence confirmed what eyes already knew. There was no organized force left. Bodies lay in lines where men had advanced in formation. Others marked failed retreats, tracing paths of desperation back toward the rear. Equipment was scattered everywhere, rifles abandoned, helmets crushed, personal belongings torn open. Photographs would later be taken. They would never be published. Some of the wounded had survived the night. They called out as the sun rose. Their voices faded one by one. There was no evacuation. Any attempt to move them drew immediate fire. Command knew they were there. Command could do nothing. The enemy artillery resumed briefly. Not to fight, but to erase. Shells struck known positions, collapsing trenches and burying those still alive. It was cleaner, more efficient, and safer than clearing the valley by hand. By mid-morning, the last resistance ended. At headquarters, the casualty reports finally arrived in full. Not estimates. Confirmed losses. The numbers were worse than anyone had imagined. Battalion after battalion listed as combat ineffective. Companies reduced to single digits. Platoons wiped out entirely. Nearly 10,000 men. Gone. The commander read the reports in silence. Witnesses would later say he did not react, not at first. He stared at the paper as if it might change. It didn't. The realization arrived slowly, then all at once. This was not a defeat. It was a catastrophe. An immediate withdrawal was ordered across the sector. The message went out clearly this time. Too clearly. Units that were still intact pulled back in haste, fearing encirclement. Gaps opened along the front. The enemy exploited them within hours. What had been a localized disaster now weakened the entire line. Behind the front, the wounded flooded aid stations. Doctors worked until their hands shook. Morphine ran out. Bandages were reused. Men died waiting for care that never came. Some begged to be shot. Others begged not to be left alone. Survivors were gathered and questioned. Where had the enemy fire come from? Why had they advanced so far? Who gave the order to continue? The answers were inconsistent. No one had the full picture. No one wanted to admit the truth. The truth was simple. They had been sent forward based on information that was never confirmed. They had advanced into a prepared killing zone. And when it became clear something was wrong, no one stopped it. The battlefield was later inspected by senior officers. They walked the valley in silence, stepping carefully between bodies. Some took notes, others avoided looking down. One officer reportedly stopped and stared at a group of fallen men for several minutes. Then he turned away and said nothing. The slaughter was officially recorded as a necessary engagement. The phrase appeared in reports, memos, and summaries. Necessary. The word settled like dust over the dead. For the soldiers who survived, the memory never faded. They remembered the sound of machine guns starting all at once. The way orders dissolved into noise. The moment they realized no help was coming. Many would never speak of it again. Others would never stop. The valley was eventually reclaimed weeks later, after different plans, different preparations, and overwhelming force. No one mentioned the men who had died there before. The ground had been disturbed too many times. The slaughter had ended. But the consequences were just beginning. Because now came the question no report could answer. Who would pay for it? The war moved on. It always did. Within days, new offensives were planned, new maps were printed, and new units filled the gaps left by the dead. On paper, the line stabilized. The disaster was absorbed into the endless arithmetic of war. But for those who survived, nothing stabilized at all. The official investigation began quietly. There was no public announcement, no dramatic inquiry. A small committee was formed, tasked with reviewing operational outcomes. They worked behind closed doors, sifting through reports already shaped by fear and self-preservation. Responsibility dissolved as it moved upward. Each officer pointed to the intelligence. Intelligence pointed to incomplete data. Data pointed to lost patrols and broken radios. And those, conveniently, could no longer speak. The final report avoided names. It spoke of systemic failures, fog of war, and unavoidable uncertainty. The mistake that had sent thousands forward was reframed as an unfortunate convergence of factors. No single decision was blamed. No single person was punished. The dead received medals instead. Families were notified weeks later. The letters were brief and carefully worded. They spoke of bravery, duty, and sacrifice. They did not mention maps that were wrong or orders that should have been questioned. Some families received no bodies. Others received the wrong ones. For many, the only grave was memory. The survivors were reassigned. Some were sent back to the front within days. Others were rotated out, deemed unfit after what they had seen. A few were promoted, their experience now considered valuable. None were offered explanations. None were asked for forgiveness. At night the valley returned. Men woke screaming, convinced they were still under fire. Others lay awake, counting the faces they remembered and the ones they couldn't. Survivors' guilt settled in quietly. Why them? Why not me? What did I do wrong? Years later, veterans would describe the same moment. Not the gunfire, not the explosions, but the realization, sudden and unmistakable, that they had been abandoned by the plan that was supposed to protect them. That knowledge never left. The commander remained in his position. His career survived the disaster. Later victories overshadowed the loss. In official histories, the battle was reduced to a paragraph, then a sentence, then a footnote. Statistics replaced names. 10,000 became a number, not a chorus of voices cut short. The valley itself changed. Grass grew back, trees reclaimed the scars, farmers returned to land that still yielded fragments of metal and bone. Occasionally, remains were found. They were buried quietly. Historians would later debate the event. Some argued the losses were exaggerated. Others claimed the operation was necessary despite the cost. A few suggested the mistake had been obvious and unforgivable. None could bring the men back. What remained was the lesson no one wanted to learn. That war is not always decided by courage or strategy. Sometimes it is decided by a single unchecked assumption. A line written on a report. A silence interpreted as success. A decision made too quickly and defended for too long. The mistake was small. It fit neatly into a sentence. It took minutes to write. And it killed 10,000 men. History did not remember their names. But the ground did. And every soldier who heard this story understood the truth that followed them into every battle afterward. In war, the deadliest weapon is certainty.